My name is Rabbi Leonard Cohen, like the famous one. I live in Kingsland here in Calgary. My understanding of basic income is a government guarantee of a certain minimum income for every individual or family. That this is provided regardless of the person's situation, if they are in need. In some instances, the idea, I think, is that everyone simply receives a check, let's say for $10,000, but my understanding is if your income level is below a certain amount, the government will top it off and perhaps even provide more, depending on the level of income that you already have. It is a possibility and a notion of welfare reform that seems to be very cutting edge, that we are waiting to see, I suppose, a sufficient study of the model. My understanding is that Ontario had a pilot project that started started about a year ago, that was cancelled by the Ford government, which is it's quite unfortunate because it would have provided some interesting data about universal basic income, what the outcomes were. So it appeals to me ideologically or theoretically as a possibility that's worth exploring to see if it has benefits that go beyond the most obvious. In other words, does it have benefits related to health, related to food, related to employment, homelessness, all of these different things. The notion of any government's welfare policy is to be able to accommodate all of these. And so then the question is, could basic income do this more effectively than others? And it's a good question worth exploring. My hopes are simply that it be researched well, that a proper trial project be put in place and allowed to run its course properly and be studied well, so that people can have a good idea of whether it works or not in terms of economic policy, in terms of social reaction, in terms of the benefits or impacts upon the people who are the recipients of it. At this stage of the game, it remains a bit too much of just an abstract ideal that isn't well explored. I suppose that there is also one nice advantage potentially of basic income is that it can allow for a certain dignity for the recipient. Currently, for welfare, there's a means test. In other words, if you go into a welfare office, you've got to show them that you're not receiving enough. A few years ago, when my family was in a difficult situation and I had to go for it, I found it, I wouldn't say degrading. I didn't find that. The person who was interviewing me for the means test was very, very favorable and was very compassionate. But I know that that's not the case for most people. I also, what can I say? It's a subject that touches me personally, as I know there have been times in my life that I would have benefited from having such a universal basic income. But I don't know. I don't know enough about it. The fact is, we do thankfully have a certain safety net here in Canada. Whether it's adequate or not is a question. But between welfare, or however they're calling it right now, and employment insurance, this does provide a certain degree of protection, but not always a good one. My understanding is that there are a variety of challenges. Number one is how much will it cost for the governments to be able to implement this, as opposed to their current social welfare programs. We would need a pretty clear understanding of that and the ability for a government budget to be able to absorb it. Another challenge is that there's a risk that employers will sit there and say, oh, good, the government is guaranteeing a minimum basic income, so we can keep our wages down. And if I'm a large, say a Walmart or other such place, that could be a disincentive, if you will, or an incentive to keep wages down as opposed to elevating them, given that the government will guarantee the basic amount. So there could be a bit of a challenge in that way in terms of helping for poverty. And the third is just the social reality of people. With any welfare program, there can be a potential disincentive for people to work. A mother with kids might say, well, you know what, it's not really worth it for me to go back to the workforce if I'm getting this income. For other people as well, there can be a potential small disincentive. I do not believe it's a large one. Personally, I believe that for the most part, people do want to work and be productive, but it would be ideologically blind to imagine that there weren't some people who might prefer to be on the universal basic income as opposed to I suppose, you know, without the safety net. The alternative is being without a safety net, if you will, or talking for a city like Calgary, let alone one for Vancouver or Toronto, the dollar amounts involved. I mean, no one is getting rich off of it. A certain amount of the prejudice, if you will, against poverty recipients is, you know, it's an ideological thing. It's born of ignorance at times. I do not perceive your average poor person having fundamentally different values than your average middle class or upper class person in terms of what they strive for and what they would do. I think for the most part, people make, well, I wouldn't say exactly rational decisions, but you know, they make the best decisions based on their current situation. So I tend to be fairly favorable to amplifying social assistance programs. But there are the realities of government and government budgets and how they were able to make it feasible. But it's a tremendous disservice when a well-designed basic income program, such as that in Ontario, which was meant to have a 3-year period, gets cancelled abruptly. That's very unfair for people, recipients, and others who are planning around it. I know that any agency, government or nonprofit, has to have a long-term time frame to be able to plan and map out their actions accordingly. I think the Ontario program was probably the best designed such program in Canada. I understand that there was a basic income program in Manitoba in the 1970s, which did not show conclusive data one way or the other, but I don't know how it was designed, what the scope of the program was. This recent one in Ontario was extremely well thought out and designed, and very unfortunate that it was dropped, and clearly was done for ideological purposes more than budgetary ones. Well, we've got to be realistic. You know, there are certain administrations that are going to be more favorable to such a program and others that will be less so. The bottom line is that any such program needs research, needs data. For basic income to move forward, first of all, I don't jump to the assumption that it's automatically beneficial. It could turn out to be, as many people argue, prohibitively expensive, or they may find that there are other challenges in terms of implementation that just don't make it feasible. And I totally respect that perspective. I tend to be favorable to the idea of researching it, developing it. But to make any such thing a reality, it needs to be done with proper research, proper testing of the model, refinement, improvement, etc. And once there is sufficient data, then there is good arguments for or against it, and there can be a wisdom that's developed. There's a middle ground, I think, that's worth walking. I imagine the majority of people that will be watching a film like this or exposed to it will tend to be fairly more left-leaning and quite favorable towards it. To which I say that's fantastic to be able to have the sentiment and compassion, but to be aware that that compassion does need to be balanced by proper research and data and convincing evidence, if you will, beyond the emotional connection. That's generally a wise thing when it comes to policy. But by the other token, and unfortunately this may not be too many of the people that watch this, but I can tell you from personal reality, from other things, that there is no huge distinction between a poor population and a wealthier one except on living conditions, in terms of values, in terms of desires, in terms of what's important. This is not a different thing. There's that, it's a bit of a trite saying, there but for the grace of God go I. But it is true. It is true that any one of us could find ourselves in a situation, and even a person who has lived in great privilege is not immune to the threat of living this, and vice versa. A person who can be 30 years on social assistance and drug addiction can come out of it and be indistinguishable, from anyone else who's doing it. So we've got to be aware that, at the very least, even if we don't attain a universal basic income anytime too soon, we've got to be respectful of universal humanity. And I think it's a very sacred thing. If I'm a rabbi, if I believe in a God, I believe in a God that is benevolent, and one who has great faith and entrusts great responsibility in us as people, as individuals, and as a society. So, and that's not something that any one of us should take lightly or uncritically. Listen, I grew up with the greatest of privileges in some respects. I grew up, in a middle-class family, and I did find myself at a certain point having to go on welfare, having to use a food bank. And I don't say this in order to draw pity in any way, shape, or form, or I never viewed myself as significantly disadvantaged. But I'm not alone in that boat. I know that there are many other people who are, unfortunately, there's a stigma of shame that you don't get to see. There are people who live quietly, deeply affected by these threats, and there are people you wouldn't imagine that would be in that situation. It's a volatile world, volatile societies and incomes, and these are threats that aren't just abstract. They're ones that can affect any one of us. So.